All right, welcome everyone. Good evening to our first China-related event of the year. This is taking place during a time in which the South China Sea and Taiwan are critical issues, as they have been for a long time and will almost certainly continue to be. That is why it is my pleasure to have our academic advisor, Mr. Robert Sutter, here for a conversation with Johnny Webster. So take it away.
Yes, as our president, Alex Sturza, just said, the South China Sea is a very tumultuous part of the world right now. There's a lot of stuff going on in the Indo-Pacific, and it's very important to talk about. So we wanted to bring in an esteemed scholar in China-US policy and in the East Asia region, Dr. Robert Sutter. He is one of the best, if not the best, professors and scholars here at George Washington University on US-China relations. He has worked for 40 years in intelligence and in policymaking, both in Congress and the Department of State, I believe. He got his PhD from Harvard University and has written 23 books and over 300 articles relating to the East Asia region and US-China relations. So without further ado, let's get started. Please give him a round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
So yeah, welcome.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to have you here. I know it's been a long time in the making to
Not at all.
have you come out.
It's great. Thank you very much.
Of course. As what was said repeatedly, the Indo-Pacific is a very tumultuous region right now. There's a lot of competition going on between both the US and China. And let's start with the background. What is the reasoning for why these countries are acting the way that they do?
I think in the South China Sea, I'm giving you an American perspective, but in the South China Sea, it wasn't tumultuous or contested very much during the Cold War. But after the Cold War was over, China, which had to guard against the Soviet Union for such a long time, no longer had to do that. And so it was free then to look into its claims along the rim of China, the maritime claims in particular, and in the Southeast Asia, it was the South China Sea. And there they found, of course, they knew this already, but the other countries had been intruding on their claim. But their claim is not legal, and under the terms of the law of the sea, it's now been determined to be illegal. But nonetheless, this is their claim. And so what they saw that these over 200 oil rigs were in this area pumping oil and gas that should have been China's. And so they decided, they needed to do something about that. And they were just coming out of the Tiananmen, so they were isolated. That occurred with the end of the Cold War, the Tiananmen incident. So they were isolated from the West. And so they were very careful. They wanted to build relations with these countries around them, but at the same time, they wanted their territory. And so this clash of interest led to an incident in 1995 where China took over a reef that was the Philippines. And this became a serious issue, and China had to back away. They didn't want to cause big problems. And so they came up with a strategy to be very nice to the neighbors, the good neighbor policy, and they meant it. And on these kinds of issues, they kept to a very moderate stance. Now, this is all in line with Deng Xiaoping's injunction to China, hide your intentions and bide your time. But they continued this for 5 years. But they were still very critical of the United States in a lot of ways. But that stopped when the George W. Bush came into power in 2001, and he was very firm and very tough. He said China's not our strategic partner, it's our strategic competitor. And he was very firm about this, and he had a capacity to do things before he got bogged down in Iraq and Afghanistan. And so the Chinese saw that, and they adjusted then, and so they had a good neighbor policy. They extended that to the United States. And this is called the peaceful rise approach. They took this approach, and it's lasted for 10 years. So we're talking 15 years of pretty nice relations and building up their economies and building contacts in Southeast Asia, very constructive relations. But they got impatient with that, and they wanted more. And they found, they being the authorities in Beijing, found that their leadership was too passive in dealing with it now. They had to be more assertive. And so they moved towards selecting a more assertive leader, who was Xi Jinping, the current leader. He was selected in 2012. But the pushing began in 2009 and 10. The U.S. looked weak because of Afghanistan and Iraq and the big crisis economically. China was strong, and they wanted to push ahead. And they did, and pressed Obama. Obama came into power, and they tested him in a lot of different ways. And pretty small things, but significant. And Obama got tired of this, and he felt, and interesting about the Obama people, they were very open about what they were doing. They would invite people like me to come together. We'd have a meeting like this, and they would tell us what the policy was. Once or twice we had the National Security Advisor doing that. Isn't that neat? And they would do that, and you'd learn all this stuff. It was great. And so what did you get? Well, the rebalance policy. And the rebalance policy was designed to put more pressure on the region. Not pressure, put more activity on the region. Basically, more diplomacy, more economic connections, and more security presence. Not a lot increase in security presence, though. And to do what? To make these countries stronger. And the notion was, you make them stronger, that's what we want. That'll keep a balance of power in Asia, and a hostile power like China, if it's a hostile one, won't be able to dominate, because these will be very strong states, backed by us and others, and that's enough. That'll meet our security interest, and of course economically it was a vibrant area, they wanted to be connected with that, and so forth. And so it was a great idea, and the governments in the region liked it, but China of course didn't. And China saw this as containment. You're trying to surround us with all your activities, and yet the Obama people, and this, I watched the National Security Advisor do this. He said, don't they know we can't confront them? We can't disrupt the relationship with them, because if we do that, then these neighbors, these people that we want to, in the region that we want to have good relations with, will be upset, because they didn't want this kind of trouble. And so rebalance was designed to strengthen these countries in a way that didn't upset China. Very hard to do that, and yet that's what they were trying to do. The upshot was that it was successful in building a structure, successful in interactions, diplomacy was very successful, but the Chinese had other ambitions. And the Chinese at this point now said, we're going to move, we want control of certain territories. And they confronted Japan in the East China Sea on the Senkaku Islands, Diaoyu Senkaku Islands, and they confronted the Philippines over Scarborough Shoal. And in Scarborough Shoal, the Americans backed the Philippines, but not that strongly, and they mediated. And they said, okay, everybody leave, the Philippine forces and the Chinese forces. These were generally Coast Guard forces or very light military. The Philippine naval forces are light military. I mean, they're big ships. They're old U.S. Coast Guard carriers, Coast Guard cutters. So the upshot is that the Philippines left and the Chinese never did. Now, what did the U.S. do? Anybody know? That's because there's nothing there. They didn't do anything. It just happened. That's not good when you're dealing with an expansionist power. And and the point is, they said, well, it's not expansionist. And I don't know why, the rationale but it got a little harder to do this when the Chinese then moved into, after this, then the next year they began their island building. And this is where they take reefs and they make them into military installations. They dredge, they create land, they build airstrips, they surround it with various defense mechanisms so they can protect it. They have a port, and they built 7 of these, and 3 of them are major bases. They're major outposts, and the U.S. didn't pay much attention to this. what happened, one thing that happened was concurrent in 2014, there was a big episode with Vietnam. And a big oil rig, China had a big oil rig, and they put that oil rig right into the claimed area of the Vietnamese. And they started drilling. And of course, they knew the Vietnamese would confront them, so they had 100 ships with them. These are Coast Guard, maritime militia ships. And they came in, they surrounded the rig, and the rig was portable. You know, they're bringing it in to put it down. And the Vietnamese resisted. And they sent their maritime militia, and they sent their frogmen, and it was all sort of, not a lot of, there wasn't any shooting. It was all hitting and ramming and things like that. And that went on for weeks until riots broke out in Vietnamese cities, and they started burning down everything they could see that was Chinese. And then the Chinese had to make this, to move the rig. But the thing about the rig is that it took all the attention off the island building. Nobody was paying attention to the island building, which was much more significant. And by 2015, the island building was known, the scope of it was enormous, and it was ready to be militarized. And of course, the U.S. said, well, don't militarize it. So the U.S. was complaining, Obama was complaining publicly about this. Not a lot, but publicly. And the administration felt that he was really doing a good job. This meeting that we would have, they would tell us about this. We really told them. Yeah, they told them. And it went one ear and out the other, you know. And Xi Jinping comes out of the meeting and says, we're not going to militarize. And of course, they're doing it right as he says that. And so, and in 4 weeks, it's all militarized. And so you have this kind of relationship. And so the upshot is, what's the problem here? And one of Obama's secretaries of defense, I'll remember his name in a minute, but he was later testified. He said, the guy didn't like to apply power. Do you understand? He felt that led to dumb things. That's what got Bush into Iraq, and Iran, and that was a bad thing. And he said, I don't want to do that. And he didn't like it. And so, okay, if you don't like it, then Xi Jinping says, he doesn't like it. And so he can go ahead. He's not going to have any big consequence. And that's what happened. So people watched this in Congress. The Republicans in Congress were very critical of Obama's passive foreign policy and a whole range of issues. This was not the central issue. There were so many others. And that was, but then we had an election campaign in 2016. And so the Obama thing was subject to some debate. But the South China Sea was not a big issue. Donald Trump was running, but it was trade issues were much more important. The TPP was a big controversy. This is a Trans-Pacific Partnership, an economic agreement at that time. So no more multilateral agreements for the United States. That was what the issue was. And the big guy there was Bernie Sanders. That was Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump were the two leading proponents of that. And then so South China Sea. So the record here up to now, and Obama, he wanted a stable relationship with China. He wanted China in the Paris Agreement. He thought that was an important thing to do, and he didn't want to jeopardize that over the South China Sea. When people like me would complain to my friends in the White House and say, what are you doing? You're letting the Chinese off the hook on South China Sea. And he says, do you want to jeopardize the whole relationship because of the South China Sea? So it's important to think, when did that happen, that the South China Sea became so important? I think today you would say, yes, this is very important. But in those days, do you see what I mean? The relative importance of the South China Sea was low in the policy realm. So that happens. That happens. So that's sort of Obama. Should we move into what happens later?
Yes.
Yeah.
As you started to mention in the 2016 election, Trump was more worried with trade, but during his presidency, he definitely made different shifts than the passive approach of Obama. Would you be able to go into how the Trump, you could say Trump 1.0, the first administration, how that differed from Obama's approach?
Okay, well, this is a very interesting story. I feel so privileged, and can I wax a little bit? You know, when I first came to Washington, it was still the Cold War. China was in the Cultural Revolution. I was working at CIA then, and I watched the change in China. The U.S. was changing its policy. Nixon was opening to China. It was all very secret. I didn't know about that. My job was to look at what the Chinese were doing. I said, why are they doing that? They're changing. And they're moving from a very xenophobic position to one that was much more accommodating of the United States. How did that happen? And then I realized that something's going on the U.S. side that's making this happen. Anyway, it was great to watch this. And then all this came out, and engagement started. I said, wow, isn't this wonderful, this change? And now, in the last 8 years, I've been in a position to watch it change again, in reverse. In the sense the whole engagement thing has just been put aside. And now we're very much into acute rivalry with China. And so why? And how did that happen? Obama obviously didn't want that. George W. Bush didn't want that. So what happened? Well, the people in the Trump administration looked at the evidence, and they came up with an assessment that said this has to change. This is, whatever we're basing our assumption on, we're being taken to the cleaners. And we really have to protect ourselves in this situation. And so they came up with a national security strategy, which was just like the Cold War, except it wasn't the Soviet Union as the main threat, it was China. And the U.S. had never seen China as the number one threat. So that was a big change. But you know something? Nobody paid attention to it. The media, very little coverage. Public opinion had no bearing at all. And so who did pay attention? Well, the people in the administration that wrote the document, they tended to be in the Defense Department, the FBI, worrying about internal penetration by China, and the U.S. Trade Representative. They saw China's economic policies as a fundamental threat to the United States. So those folks, they found allies in Congress. Congress really resonated with. They were very unhappy with what was happening. They said, you know, this isn't our job. We're not supposed to be protecting the country. You and the executive branch are supposed to be doing that, and you're not doing it. And so therefore, we need to do it. And that's what and so they came together. And that took place very rapidly in the early part of 2018. And by August of 2018, they passed a major bill. And it calls for what? The Congress demands that the U.S. create a whole of government effort to counter challenges coming from China. And it wasn't quite clear what these challenges were, and there were many of them. South China Sea was one. But over time, the challenges kept growing. And as you know, just living here for a while, we constantly see new ones. You know, we had balloons flying over the country. That was a new challenge. We didn't know about that before. And we didn't know that TikTok was a problem. But it is a problem. From the U.S. security people, it's a very big problem. And so you had all sorts of things like this. And so it involved internal governance, it involved economic issues, and it involved security issues. And I try to summarize these things. And so the first is one that's pretty overt, and China wants to be the leading power in Asia. And it wants to make sure the U.S. doesn't in its way, which means the U.S. will be pushed out of Asia. And that's how it's going to happen. That's what they want. And the countries and neighbors of China will have to accommodate themselves to China as the leading power. And then the second one, and that's pretty overt. They use coercive means. A lot of it, they use private warnings too, things that they don't publicize. And then the next one is economic. And this is all sorts of issues that you see. And it's the practices, and this is Chinese practices that really get the Americans upset. Because they're doing various things that are very underhanded and illegal according to the agreements that they've signed in the WTO, among other things. And so but they continue to do this. And now they've reached a point where the party state can have an industrial policy that mobilizes the whole Chinese state to support it. And Huawei is a good example of that. And so the result is they can select, develop in a highly protected atmosphere, take the technology, a lot of it stolen and taken in various means from Western countries or coerced from other countries, and then build up these national champions, which then can go out into the world and dominate the industry. And they did that with steel. They did that with solar panels. And now they're doing it with electric vehicles. And that's their MO. And so they choose and they dominate. And so this is a very bad situation. And now it's reached a point where they're dominating the high technology industries. And then the third one is governance and how global governance works. And Chinese are undermining that in a lot of different ways, supporting Putin and people like that. And we can talk about that some more if you want. So these three collective challenges were very important, and the South China Sea was part of that security thing, a fundamental area in the security. And there are two existential threats. And I think this is really important to understand from the point of view, at least the Congress, and I think the administration people to a considerable degree. And this is that they feel greatly challenged. This is a very important contest. This isn't just a rivalry to who's going to be number one. This is going to be the rivalry of who's going to dominate. And here, what you find is that a country that dominates Northeast Asia from the American perspective and is hostile to the United States is a direct threat to the United States. Imperial Japan showed that. When they were dominant, the U.S. didn't stop them, and they eventually attacked Hawaii. And the same context, same calculation works in Europe. If the Nazis took over Western Europe, that would have been very bad for the United States. They would have been a direct threat. So this kind of threat is felt as an existential one. So the Chinese obviously are determined to do this, and South China Sea is a big part of that. The other dominant one, of course, is the high-tech technology. If China wins that high technology race, the U.S., which is a key area of the U.S. economy, loses that. That's a real loss, a very serious loss for the United States, very bad. But what's worse is that high technology is fundamentally important for the militaries of the world. And if you don't have the highest technology, you will be subservient to the person in the country that does. And who will that be? That will be China. So members of Congress look at this and they say, oh, if we don't do this, we'll be dominated by China. And last time I looked, there's nobody in Congress that wants to be dominated by China. And so this led to this very strong bipartisan urgency. Do it, and do it now. Make sure we are countering these challenges. These are fundamental challenges to our way of life, our country. And if we don't do this, we're going to be under their thumb. I hope you understand. But that's what, if you don't get that appreciation, America looks like it's really crazy. It's not crazy if you have that logic. And it comes from very sensible people. This isn't, it's not a bunch of there are crackpots in Congress, but this isn't crackpots. This is very mainstream people. You know, my senator, Mark Warner, and these very centrist people, and very knowledgeable. He's been on the Senate Intelligence Committee for, 10 years. He really knows the issues. And he's changed his mind. He was a high technology executive, became governor, big interaction with Chinese, and then he fundamentally changed. And you ask him why he changed, he said, I read too many intelligence reports. So that's what happened. So this is a reality that we have to deal with. And the South China Sea is right there. And so the idea of Obama not paying attention to it, that's over. That era is over. We pay attention to these things because there's too much at stake from the American point of view not to pay attention to that. And so, so under Trump, there was a hardening on this issue. Now, Trump himself, he didn't harden. South China Sea, China Sea, he didn't care. He didn't go down. He didn't go to the meetings of Southeast Asian countries. He didn't. And so as a result, U.S. influence declined. But Pompeo, his Secretary of State, was very adamant on this, very committed to this. And and then Trump changed his strategy, his approach to China, to be very negative. He had the trade war, but that was not being terribly negative. He still wanted to have good relations with China, and he wanted a deal, and he was ready to deal. So they had the trade war. Then they had a truce, and then they negotiated for over a year to reach. So nothing significant changed, and they had an agreement. And January, and so he said, "What a great agreement! We really did a great thing." And then in March, COVID hit. March 2020, and 100,000 Americans would die in every month, and the stock market just tanked completely. And that was going to be what he was running on, prosperity. I had given you all this great prosperity, and then he had it was prosperous in January. It was prosperous. Well, he had to change, and he shifted, and they said, "Go after China." So he went after China, and so he's very adamant about that. So. Frankly, it was a political decision for him, it seems to me. In other words, he made a change because he said, "I got to get elected, and that's my target. I'm going to do it." And so he did. But what he did is free up all these people in his administration who were tough on China, and there were a lot of them. In the security side, in the economic side, and so they had full reign, and they were really tough. But it was scattered, and it wasn't very effective. And so in the end, it was posturing, but it didn't help a lot. So Biden did a better job, but keep in mind that Biden in 2019, when he was running for election, late 2019, running to get the nomination in the Democratic Party for the presidency, foreign policy was hardly ever mentioned in these debates, and interviews rarely mentioned much about foreign policy. But when they did, of course, Biden was the foreign policy expert, vice president, Senate Foreign Relations Committee chair. So he was the foreign policy person. So they would ask him a foreign policy question. They'd ask him a question about China. And this happened about 15 times. And he was asked about China. He says, "Are you worried about China? You know, some people are worried about China. What about you? Are you worried about China?" He says, "I'm not worried about China. Why should I worry about China? We're much more powerful than China. Do you have another question?" That's the way he handled it. He changed. He learned, and by the time he got into office, he was he had this sense, just like the Congress, this is bipartisan Congress. This is not partisan at all. These are Democrats and Republicans looking at the issue and saying, "My God, we got to do something." And so that's what they're doing. And so the upshot is he joined that. The two collaborated and were, I think, quite successful in counterbalancing China. Biden at the end said, "I checked China," and I think he did. He stopped them. They were on the defensive. He reversed it in the South China Sea and other places in the region. The Indo-Pacific strategy that he carried out was done effectively, and with the collaboration of what did he do? He mustered the allies and partners. He said, "Look, let's work on this together." And he did that. And Japan and Australia and India were very happy to cooperate in the Quad. And other countries cooperated too. The Southeast Asian countries didn't want to side with the United States too much, so they hedged. But you know what happened? Putin invaded Ukraine. That happened in February of 2022. And everybody thought that attention would be diverted from Asia and focus on Russia. Well, it was diverted, but you know what happened? The Europeans said, "Oh my God, look what the Russians are. These are really a threat. We really have to work with the United States to defend Europe in the face of this." And then they said, "Oh, who's backing Russia? Who's the main international enabler of Putin's attack on Ukraine? China." And China was then lobbying to make sure these countries didn't line up against Russia. And so what happened was they said, "Oh, well, if they're going to support that, then what is China going to do? China's going to be free then to attack Taiwan." And then they started thinking about the security situation in East Asia, which the Europeans had hardly paid any attention to. That was always America's thing. But they looked at Taiwan and said, If they do that, we're going to lose all these computer chips that we need. Taiwan's going to be under China's control, or it's going to be destroyed. And that's a disaster for our economy. So they came to say, my God, we need Taiwan. We have to be concerned about Taiwan. And the Americans had the same logic. They had to be concerned about Taiwan. And so the upshot of this was that the Europeans, and Biden brought them in. And so NATO would have meetings, and the Japanese, the Australians, the New Zealanders, and South Korea would be in the meeting. They were collaborating together. And so what was the deterrence of China? It was this kind. Were all these countries going to fight China in the South China Sea? No. But did they patrol down there? Yes. And did they try to deter China? Yes. And what did they do to Russia when it attacked Ukraine? They put sanctions on them, lots of them. And that would be a disaster for China. I mean, Putin had the economy that isn't so reliant on these sort of things. But if you start sanctioning the Chinese economy, that's going to be very serious. So the deterrence broadened, the help for Taiwan broadened from being sort of narrowly focused on U.S. military power to being focused on this economic power, this North America too. Canada had the same reaction. And so we had a very close type of relationship. And Biden did that. You know, he doesn't get a lot of credit, but he really, his people were systematic and very careful in doing this, and effective. And so Xi Jinping looked around and he found, he looked at Northeast Asia. He didn't have a lot of strong points there. He looked at India, not strong points there. Australia was a disaster for him. And so he was still the dominant power in Southeast Asia, but he lost the Philippines. And that was a very key loss for him. Geographically, it's a very important place. So, so in the South China Sea, he was a lot more effective than Trump. And where's Trump on this? You know, I guess we'll get into that. And you know, now he's president again. But when he was president, he just didn't care about a lot of things, and he didn't care about this. And so he left it to these other people to be a hard line. But it was very erratic and not put together well. Whereas Biden's team all spoke in the same language. They didn't fight with one another, and they kept pushing these checks on China, and China was on the defensive, and they felt they had to compromise. The biggest compromise they made was that Biden's people understood that what they were doing was hardening their policy, that this would take away things that China had previously had easy access to, the economy, the politics of the United States, and that it was easy for them to interact with them. That was going to be taken away, and the Chinese would be very angry about this. And therefore there would be more friction, particularly on these friction points like Taiwan and the South China Sea. So they understood that. And they said, what we need to do is make sure while this happens, this is going to happen, while this happens, that we don't have war. How do we do that? And so communication. It's going to have a lot of communications. And so they said, let's have these talks. The guardrail talks is what they call them, to guard against war. And the Chinese wouldn't do it unless the U.S. met all sorts of conditions. And they had all the list of conditions. They would give the Secretary of State, you know, a list of 12 things he had to do to clean up his act before the Chinese would agree to talks. Well, Xi Jinping in November 2022 met with Biden, and he said, let's talk, and no conditions. That's a compromise. And you don't get Xi Jinping to compromise every day. And of course, he never said it was a compromise, but think about it. It was a big compromise. And so that's Biden's strategy. In other words, he didn't want war. He wanted to avoid war. And yet he wanted to deter China. What he was doing is creating positions of strength at home and abroad to make it in the interest of China to cooperate. You're better off cooperating than you are confronting. And if you confront, you're going to get costs. So you don't want these costs, so cooperate. Even though you don't like us, you cooperate. Do you see what I mean? That was the logic of what he was doing. And I think it was pretty effective.
We'll have one more question, and then we'll open it up to the audience. Mm-hmm. The Biden administration was, as you have said, very effective in being able to put a check on Chinese power and ensure that the world also started to put checks in the South China Sea through patrolling and supporting Taiwan. However, just recently we've now had Trump come back into power, and this brings with it a new strategy to combating China and Chinese dominance in the South China Sea. What do you see going forward, the difference being between the Biden strategy and now the new Trump strategy?
Well, this is we don't know what the new Trump strategy is, and what we see is a lot of action, and a lot of shock and awe, and it's very hard to exactly say where it's going to wind up. And I think China's the key actor here that you need to look at is U.S.-China competition, which has grown in this region and is the reason for the tensions in the South China Sea. Is that going to continue? And of course, on the one hand, you have evidence that Mr. Trump wants a deal with China. He wants to have some deal. He talks about this all the time, and he's very moderate in his rhetoric about Xi Jinping. No other leader in the United States talks about China that way. I mean, they're all have a negative tone when they deal with China and Xi Jinping, but not Trump. And of course, he's so that's one thing. And what you find, he's just reversed the whole American policy toward Russia. We're just not. I mean, that's an incredible thing to do, and he's accomplished that. So he has a lot of control. He has a lot more control of the government, the executive branch, and he controls the Republican Party and the Congress as a result, because they control the Congress. So he has that control. And so this shift from Russia, all these members, well, I know many of them, and they don't like Russia, they don't like Putin, and yet they say nothing, or they say, well, we're with Trump. Do you see what I mean? It's amazing to see that. So could that happen with China? And that, in other words, if he makes a deal, he says, well, I'm going to make peace, and we're going to have a great agreement, and Taiwan, well, you take care of yourself, Taiwan, and that'll be fine. Don't worry, China. Xi Jinping told me you're going to be fine, so don't worry. That's the kind of thing that might happen, and it's a nightmare for Taiwan and for Japan and other countries concerned, Australia, other countries concerned about U.S. Allies. And he's already done a lot of damage by the way he's treated the European allies. They think, well, if he treats them that way, we're going to get it too. And so that's been disrupted for sure. So we have that kind of situation. Well, there are pieces of evidence that lead me to believe now, but I watch this very carefully. But these pieces of evidence suggest that we do have a strong security commitment to the region. And that shows in the report last week of this Defense Department interim strategy, which was sent out to all the military installations. And it says, we're going to focus on China. We're going to risk withdrawing our troops from elsewhere, like in Europe, and we're going to focus our forces to deal with the China contingency, and particularly Taiwan. And so the Defense Secretary sent this forward, and my sense is that you have to be loyal to Trump in this administration. It's very important. So I don't think he's insubordinate. He must have some okay from Trump to do this. So this has gone forward. And then the other thing, you're dealing with people like the National Security Advisor, the Secretary of State, and the Secretary of Defense. They all have a record of being tough on China. And the Secretary of State, in the Congress, he had unsurpassed the record of being tough on China. He was #1 in doing that. And so the point is, how does he rationalize what's been going on with Russia? And he gave an interview 2 weeks ago, and I saw the last weekend that it's been now posted by the State Department, so it's an official document. So and there he says this about Russia. He says, we can't allow Russia and China to continue to get closer and work against us. We have to do something about that. And what we're trying to do by being nice to Russia is to peel off Russia from China. So do you understand? Sort of reverse Nixon here, peel off Russia from China. So that makes sense to me. That's a strategy that makes sense. It justifies the positive view of Putin that Trump is putting forward, and it shows a hard line toward China. And the other things that they're doing, smaller things, are all emblematic of being tough on China. That continues. Congress continues to be tough on China, countering the various challenges. All of this is ongoing. And so my sense is that, therefore, the security side is going to be enhancing what's been going on, toughening it, and perhaps making it too militant and too military dominant. Biden was much more, and of course Biden was much more collaborative. This administration doesn't like to collaborate. They just announce and go forward. So that's a bad thing in Asia, but that's what they tend to do. So that's not going to work too well. But the other side of this is the economics. And the tariffs are very tough. Now we're going to have tariffs that's 65% on China. Trump talked about this in the campaign. He said, we're going to have 60% tariffs on China. That's what he said. Everybody said, what? He must be crazy, you know? Well, there it is. We have now 60% tariffs on China. So that's very extreme. And so the point is that's not friendly, if you see what I mean. Now, Trump may want a deal with China. They may force the Chinese into a deal, and that's maybe his ultimate objective. But right now, all we see is toughness. He's still very nice in his rhetoric. You know, he doesn't criticize Xi Jinping or anything like that. But this is what he's done. So it's but is this an effective policy? No, because I don't think so, because this really disrupts the region. The neighbors, the way that tariffs are used not just for the economic factor, they're used as a coercive club against countries like Canada, Mexico, and Colombia, and whatever. And so these countries and allies and partners in Asia said they could do that to us. They are doing it to us now. And so that really undermines your relationship to some degree. So I think that what we're looking at is the security dimension will keep us very involved in Asia. I think that's pretty clear. But will we be effective, or will the countries be influenced by us in positive ways? I'm not so sure. And I think that there's a lot of negatives that are going on for these countries. And so so I think basically our influence in the region will decline. How much? I don't know, but it's pretty clear it's going to be. Obama had a much better way of going about it as far as U.S. influence is concerned. So it's too bad, but that's where we are, and that's the leaders we have, and so we're just dealing with that. And
very bleak reality of the situation right now. But at this time, if anyone has questions, we have